Hi everyone. So I want to talk about a subject that I think I've mentioned before, but how science disempowers us. The other day there was somebody talking about food and how you've got to be careful with sugar and all foods that contain sugar, like fruit not good for you. And I was thinking that actually it's not true. I mean, if you look at fruit, for example, I mean, fruit does contain fructose. That's the science. But that's the trouble with science. That science, modern science works by breaking things apart and examining the parts, and the whole of biochemistry, physiology is really based on breaking things apart. How else are they going to find out how a biochemical process works? They've got to take that whatever it is out and go to a laboratory and look at test tubes and try work out how the processes actually work. And that's the way science works. And look at the world we have today. We have cars, we have TV, cell phones, and all that kind of stuff. And that comes around out from the way science works, breaking things apart. But if you take a look at water, for example, water is H2O, hydrogen and oxygen. That's what they say. But, if you examine hydrogen separately and oxygen separately, there's no way you could tell that putting them together would create water. Absolutely not. So hydrogen has some properties and oxygen has some properties. But when you combine them together in a particular way, they give up those properties completely. And what emerges is new properties, and that's called emerging. Science calls that emerging processes at work. So hydrogen and oxygen make water. But you can't understand hydrogen and oxygen from examining water either. So, but when you take water apart, you discover, there's hydrogen and oxygen. Then you can try and identify the nature of water from hydrogen and oxygen, but you can't. So there's something that happens when things come together in a unique way. They give up their individual properties, and what emerges is new properties that were never there before. So let's have a look at fruit sugar. The same thing applies. You can take apples apart, oranges apart, whatever you want to, and spread it out. Look what we have over here. We have a whole range of minerals and trace elements and peptides and amino acids and all this kind of stuff. But what happens when you put them together? New properties emerge. The individual face of those particular individual particles disappears, and out comes an apple, out comes a pineapple, out comes a banana. Now you can break them apart. There's fructose, and fructose is like glucose. It's a sugar. So one has to be careful of sugars because they put on weight. But you see, that doesn't apply. It doesn't make sense to me. That fructose in the apple has given up its properties to create the apple. That fructose in the watermelon has given up its properties to create the apple. And the sodium and potassium and all the trace elements, which are there, no doubt, but they give up their properties in order to create this unique gift of a fruit, for example, or whatever it is. So it could be a vegetable. In that vegetable and in that fruit, the individual properties that you can find when you break them apart don't function in that kind of way. They function in a totally unique way. So we have to be careful. I guess we could say yes, but, when you eat a banana, the body breaks it all apart. Maybe. And maybe that's absolutely true. But we don't know what's going on in that apple when the things come together and give up their unique properties. Then in creating this whole fruit, what is this fruit? Is it made of the constituent parts? Or do the constituent parts give up their individual properties and new properties emerge? There are new properties emerge in that apple that aren't there in the individual items. So those new properties that emerge when you eat that fruit, what happens to those emerging properties which are now in that fruit? They're not functioning in the same way as the individual items are. There are new properties there. When you're eating that apple and the food is digesting it and breaking it apart, it releases those new properties that were there in the unique item. So we need to be really careful. We don't understand what food is. It's not the individual properties. It's much more. There are emerging properties in that new item. That whole apple has vitamins and minerals and all those kinds of things, plus the emerging properties which are there. So you're not just eating those items which you can find when you break them down. So science keeps missing these kinds of things, because all they can do is, they can obviously, what they should be doing is looking at the whole apple and doing the science around the whole apple. But then science doesn't work that way. He actually wants to break it apart and try and understand the individual parts. The individual parts don't make the whole. And we have to be careful about that. And we need to understand that it even in a strange way applies to our relationships, because we tend to use the thinking mind in a relationship, and the thinking mind breaks things apart. That's the nature of thinking. That's why we use our thinking mind for science. Breaks things apart, likes to do that. So the thinking mind, when it meets somebody, it makes a judgment call, and it does a judgment call by breaking things apart of that person, looking at the person's body, looking at the sound of their voice, and all this kind of stuff. And very often the thinking mind is what is making the judgment call around a person. There are other ways to deal with the whole. We can go to our heart and our knowing mind, which puts things back together again and makes a judgment call based on feeling and knowing. But if we make a judgment call based on thinking, then we're using the same thinking mind which the scientists use to break things apart and make a judgment call on the parts, rather than a judgment call on the feeling and the knowing. A different way of operating completely. So, it's such an interesting thing, this. So be careful. Science disempowers us. Science is only one way of assessing the world, and that's fine. There's nothing, I love science, but be careful how we use it. It gives us a certain view of the world. There's another view. So it's like the objective-subjective story again. Science gives us much more an objective view of the world. And then there's our heart and our knowing self. It gives us a subjective world. Both of them need to be brought together in order to understand reality. Have a good day.